While it may be common knowledge that history is written by the victors of wars, and propaganda is something used by governments to control the thought streams of the populace, where is it in the modern day, contemporary knowledge of mainstream found that this issue is addressed when going back through the history of various things such as art? I contend that it's not really addressed, not properly, not to my satisfaction. And in the years of research I've done, looking at history, I found a gulf, a gap between what would logically follow from that old adage of history being written, or rather rewritten, by the victors of wars, and the scrutiny of scholars when it comes to historical narratives, especially regarding art. And this is something that I had delved into and looked at and found the control over artistic work that is something that many of us run up against even today through censorship under the guise of community guidelines or educational scholarship, the integrity of which is supposedly maintained through these groups, an oligarchy of sorts in various places throughout society that is similar to something I would call guilds, or what used to be called guilds. And this is where I found the answer, because many questions were brought up. I've addressed photographic manipulation, but if you go before that, there was manipulation, or at least control, probably a lot of both, in the works of propaganda. Now, these were not as widespread. Paintings weren't seen by so many people. It probably wasn't even imagined how many people would have seen some of the paintings by certain artists who, oftentimes, it's funny, their work is popularized after their death. It's after they've passed on that they are accepted. And why would that be? Maybe because some of them would protest and say, that is not what I painted, or it wasn't exactly like that. Well, who controls artwork? And I'm talking not only about paintings, but sculpture and architecture. It was the guilds that exist today in different forms, maybe not by that name, but it makes sense for unions to exist, to avoid the exploitation of labor, and to have regulations that control trade to make it fair. But it's funny, trade should be assumed to be fair, yet we have fair trade in a few areas. Sometimes you buy coffee beans, they're actually cherries, and it will say that they are fair trade commodities. Well, shouldn't everything be fair trade? Well, that's a little tidbit of reality for you, that almost nothing is actually fair trade, but much of what you buy, consume, and see, going back centuries, is rather unfair trade, thanks in part to guilds. Now, I am not casting aspersions or making an indictment against those who are part of unions or so-called secret societies or modern-day guilds of various sorts and kinds, because they do good work, and it makes sense that there should be some kind of an organization for fair trade, or at least regulated trade, that is a compromise of fairness. But that would be, well, very optimistic. The reality is that there was a tight control, and it's more along the lines of cartels and organized crime, mafias, going back. In fact, the origin of mafias stems in large part from the medieval guilds that existed, supposedly, ostensibly, for reasons that are sensible, and quite possibly began that way. But what happens with rulers and those who want to shape the minds of the public, they certainly had a thing or two or three to say about each and every piece of artwork that was not only created, bought, sold, transferred, transported, displayed, declared, taxed, passed through an estate, etc., for centuries, so that nothing would get through without a stamp of approval from the upper echelons of the social hierarchies of the various countries. Now, this can get into a debate about whether or not there's any coordination among these countries. And the typical line for those who look into alternative theories and histories is to center on the so-called secret societies that do exist and play a part and a role, but there's no way that it could be coordinated on such of a grand scale. And the cooperation that would have to take place for certain concepts to be squashed, quashed, prevented, diminished, mitigated, and censored, versus these other concepts that appeal to the authorities that may be illogical but are promoted as being part of an overall image or a bandwagon that people are encouraged to jump on, whether it's a way of thinking or saying something, maybe the development of a technology, the people responsible for it. Look at all the artwork that promotes Thomas Edison, for example. I'm sure there's more out there than anybody would realize. It's very obvious that Thomas Edison, for example, was somebody that was very much promoted. But it was no different going back hundreds of years in the past. And without doing a lot of research, a cursory look, a step back, using logic, common sense, critical thinking, that makes it very plausible and feasible for one to see that much of what you are looking at may not be the original work in museums, or the story behind it may not be exactly what they are saying. And why would that be? What would they be trying to hide? Well, it could be some pretty fantastic things. Technologies that existed long before they were introduced to the public. The stories behind them, sometimes comical, that have holes in them, whether they be anachronisms or problems with the timelines associated with it. Well, there's much to look at. This video is an introduction to the concept that guilds existed, not exactly like what conspiracy theorists would consider a secret society to be, but it's more of a common understanding and a natural outflow of the structure of humanity. And I think anybody who studies anthropology would agree there are common themes found in any society, and one of them would be the control of information. Another would be guilds or organized groups, cartels, as it were. But whether for self-preservation, self-promotion, protection from assaults or invasion, or to compete with other regions for the import or export businesses, there's a lot behind it, and it's very complicated. But to think in the simple way, you can understand why this idea that you can go to a museum and look at things and see that that's the history and that's all there is to it is really not even likely. It's almost not even possible when you consider how much must have been censored. And imagine this. You are somebody living centuries ago, and you're a talented painter or sculptor, and you paint or sculpt a scene that depicts the reality of the situation, but it portrays perhaps a technology that was invented by somebody who isn't as popular and invented ahead of somebody who was more esteemed by society, and it contradicts the narrative. Perhaps it shows a bad decision by a leader, maybe represented just in an article or an item depicted in the painting, perhaps in the background. It could be something so plain as that, so likely. If you are a great artist, extremely talented, it wouldn't matter to the guilds. They may want you to be part of the guild, but you would have to swear an oath of some sort to produce works that are consistent with what they promote, what they teach, what they support, and what, more importantly, the powers at the time and to come would also be behind. That limits it down so much that you don't see a lot of art that makes it through. In fact, I find there's a cutoff around 1850 where the amount of artifacts of any kind radically diminish to just a handful. And you go back centuries before that and it becomes almost non-existent. What makes it through is almost like a meme, like a trope. It's almost ridiculous. It's almost all the same. For example, in Europe, you would think that 100% of everybody had the same religious views by the artwork, which is almost all religious when you get back to the 16th century and before. It'd be as if nobody thought any different. Well, there are explanations of who commissioned this. Of course, you have the church and different things. That's wonderful. But why is there nothing else? Why is there almost nothing else? There's hardly anything else. It's not that people wouldn't have been creating these things. Of course they did. But imagine yourself being one of those people. If you're not part of the guild or you don't play ball, well, you could create it anyway. But then what would you do with it? You couldn't show it. You probably would have a hard time transporting it. Who is it for? You're making something to be seen that can't be seen by anybody, lest it be condemned or appropriated. Oftentimes, I think the reason that a lot of people become famous after they die is because their life's work is finished and it can be deemed as safe. It goes this far and not farther. Even if it does grate against certain narratives, well, the fact that the artist is no longer alive and can't speak to it, they can interpret things how they want. They can date things differently if the officials agree. The artist himself or herself would not be able to stand up against it. In fact, if you look back, you see that there are almost no female artists. The guilds didn't admit them for such a long time. Now, how many of you think that females didn't do art for centuries? Almost no females did any art. Is that true, or was there suppression? Of course there was suppression. But the kind of suppression, it wasn't so much gender-based. Yes, that was part of it, but how widespread it was is the real story. And if you'd like more, then be sure to subscribe to the channel. This is Alt World History. And if you look forward to another episode, be sure to comment your support, like, share, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and look for more soon. Thank you for watching.